we can compare them. So we could compare the general rating of function and the occupational context measure initially when Jim first assesses this data when the client comes into the hospital. In other words, here we are measuring how the client perceives function versus how the environment supports function. And it looks like there is a pretty good resonance between these two tools.
So that's interesting. Both of these are non-valid tools, don't have much reliability, have no reliability established. But one is, I'm going to rate how much I perceive my occupational function in these areas. The other one is how I'm going to rate the context, the sort of environment, how well I feel supported by my mood, by the people, by my relationships, that kind of thing. So you'd expect that those scores would go up and down together if there was some integrity to those tools, right? And it certainly doesn't establish anything near validity and reliability. You need to do a lot more work to do that. But it makes me a little more comfortable that there's this kind of resonance between them.
Here we compared two of the assessments on your handout. The change in psychological flexibility to the COPM. In other words, the change in satisfaction and the change in performance. So we have three measures here in the same slide.
And I want to clarify that this is not the COPM, this is the card sort, which certainly stole a lot from the COPM, in that what we're asking people when they identify those things on the card sort, we're asking them to rate their performance on a 1 to 10 scale, and we're asking them to rate their satisfaction. Are most people familiar with the COPM? It's just that kind of rating system at the end. And so, you know, one of the assumptions, and we have some evidence to back this up in that kind of older, like we have lots of randomized controlled trials to suggest that when psychological flexibility improves, occupational function should improve. But that's, again, population study. That's not, do the people I'm treating have that perception? Does that change in them? And so what we're getting here is there's pretty decent resonance between when they use the valid, reliable tool to measure psychological flexibility, that their perception, that their function gets better and that their satisfaction gets better, follows pretty closely.
So we presented a few of the things that we're able to do with data at Rush. But I'd like to touch base quickly on my prior experience with data. I used to work for a large search executive firm here in Chicago in the past. And in the context of profitability and pleasing our stakeholders, we looked at data in every single way possible, and especially in aggregate form. We looked at history, we looked at trends, we looked to see how a change in approach changed our results, or how a new change in approach would affect our results currently. And therefore we ran dozens of scenarios. And we were pretty successful in making informed decisions and constantly improving our strategy. So when I started exploring the world of OT, I was shocked of how much data is not being used, especially since we have all this information. We collect so much information from our patients. We perform so many assessments, but we don't have a big picture. We know where everything is. You can go into the file drawer and pick out the assessment and look at the numbers and look at all this information, but you don't have the large picture. You can't compare the data. You cannot deduct anything from the data, or more importantly, you cannot make predictions. So I'm wondering, why is OT world so different? Jim talked about Google and Facebook, Amazon. I worked in finance and I saw how everybody was using data. And I'm wondering, why is it so different? Did we forget to just take a step back and recognize the opportunities that we have out there? I don't know. So one of the surprising thing was this process of working with data with Jim was a really exciting process. We started, like I said, with this big pile of information, and we first were able to just say, hey, we have X amount of women, X amount of men, and now as Jim enters his daily new patient information, it transfers into the graphs you saw.
One of the things that I'll say is that one of the barriers, I think, is that data has this reputation of being incredibly boring. And people don't go into occupational therapy because they're numbers people, usually. I went into OT because I was not a numbers person, and I didn't have to do numbers because I was doing people stuff, right? But it's been interesting. One of the responses my staff has had is excitement. I've had staff come to me and say, you know, I'm not a research person. I became a clinician. I wasn't interested in that number crunching stuff. But this is cool. I can actually say I'm getting results. Another barrier has been that before you get results, it's terrifying. Because you are like, oh my God, this is a test and I'm going to find out that I'm failing as a clinician, right? I'm going to get my numbers back and they're not going to be good. It's really important to be able to get both good and bad news, right? Because it helps you get better. Bad news is probably more helpful than good news, to tell you the truth. If you really know, like, where are the holes in my program, you can start to problem solve that stuff. But it's more painful. And if you're human, you don't like pain. Do you have some ideas about where you could start? What are some thoughts?
Well, you start entering demographics, and I can start keeping an Excel file of even their pain scale and their perceived quality of life. If you start there.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts? Where would you start?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So do you do pre and post evaluation?
Yes,
so
that's not where we started, but it is where we are now.
and this is how you derive the data, is from pre and post?
So when we're doing something like, you know, does their psychological flexibility change,